Welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the move 8 bishop d3 sideline in the poison pawn subvariation of the Winawer variation of the French defense. So the French defense is when we have the moves e4, e6, d4, d5. The Winawer is when white now plays knight to c3, and black plays bishop to b4. The main line continues with pawn to e5, pawn to c5, pawn to a3, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight to e7. Poison pawn starts with queen to g4. We have seen this move before in a previous video. This is a very complicated variation, one of the most critical and one of the most challenging for black to deal with. And earlier I said that the moves queen to c7 and c takes d4 are kind of equivalent, since they both kind of have the same idea and they both kind of go for the same setup. However, there is a reason why queen to c7 might actually be the better choice. And the reason why has to do with this sideline that we're going to talk about today. Because if we go for c takes d4 first, then white can go for bishop to d3, and if we, continue as normal with queen to c7, white can now play knight to e2. White doesn't have to take this pawn right away. And basically, the idea is that normally knight to e2, it's a move that white wants to play in order to defend, their center a bit, defend these squares. But white is normally hesitant because this knight would block the bishop on f1. But here, since the bishop is on d3, that's not a problem. And so white's development actually ends up being a lot more natural. It ends up making a lot more sense. And so the theory here generally continues with the moves d takes c3, queen takes g7, rook to g8, queen takes h7. And it should be noted here that even though the g-pawn is hanging, black should not take it because white will trap the rook with knight to g3. So instead, in this position, black will generally play queen takes e5, grabbing another pawn. Like basically, in this sideline, white's kind of developing all of their pieces while black is eating a bunch of pawns, and that's generally not a good sign. So white could also play pawn to h4 here instead, but bishop to f4 I think is just a lot more natural. Both moves are about as frequent, so queen to f6, now pawn to h4, and what's interesting is here black can take the pawn on g2 because the knight can't really go to g3 because the queen will take the bishop on f4, and putting the bishop on g3 isn't so good because black actually has a decent amount of compensation for the exchange. Like if black can give up their rook for white's dark square bishop, black's actually much happier to do that than to give it up for the knight, because what's special about the the dark square bishop is that black doesn't have one of those anymore. So white's got the bishop pair. White's got two very strong active bishops on an open board, and so it can make sense to sacrifice the rook for the dark square bishop. That's not too bad of an idea for black. So instead of playing bishop to g3, white could play castle queenside. Like according to the engine, this is the best move, even though it kind of looks like white has become alpha 0, given that white is giving up yet another pawn and is just playing for a lot of activity and all that kind of stuff. Which is okay, but if you're going to play like that, you have to be really accurate because you're kind of dancing on a tightrope whenever you're doing that kind of thing. A much more common move, which is also good, is for white to play king to f1. And after rook goes back to g8, bishop to g5, and black has to watch out for bishop takes knight, followed by queen takes rook. So after bishop to g5, queen to h8 with a queen trade is now more or less forced. Like black is more or less forced to trade queens. After queen takes, queen, rook takes, bishop to f6. White is just doing quite well here, in my opinion. White's got all of their pieces out. Like, black may have a couple of pawns for the pieces. Like, black has 6 pawns, white has 4 pawns. But this pawn will probably be won back. And this pawn, this h pawn, is very strong. And white is probably going to be trying to promote that thing. So overall, the engine gives a slight edge to white, but more importantly, white's plan is pretty easy to figure out here. Like, white's got the 2 bishops, they're very active, they're on an open board, they're having a lot of fun, whereas black's plan is not so easy. Like, black hasn't even gotten their pieces out. This is very silly, in my opinion, and I would much rather have white here. And generally speaking, when it comes to openings, you should choose lines where you like the side that you're playing, where you're not, so envious of the opponent. You're not looking at the board and going, oh, I wish I had the opponent's side. Like, at the very least, you want to be able to look at the board and say, oh yeah, things are kind of equal here, oh, I'm fine playing either side. Like, at the very least, you want to be able to say that. But here, in this position, I'd much rather have white. I think white just has a much easier time, a much easier plan to implement. But the thing is, back over here, we can kind of avoid all this craziness. Like, we can avoid giving white such a nice setup with their development. So if instead of playing c takes d4, if instead we play queen to c7, now if white plays bishop to d3 with the idea of bringing the knight to e2 with some very pleasant development, we can just say no to that. We can say, no, actually, I'm going to close everything down now, and I'm going to force you to move that bishop again. So after bishop to e2, the position is now a lot more closed, and the engine does still give white, an edge here, but in my opinion, it's much harder to figure out how to actually get that advantage, how to actually get that edge. Like, there's still a fair amount of theory, like Grandmaster Geary in his course on Chessable, he goes into a lot more depth than I'm going to go into, but overall, I think this is a much better way for black to deal with this sideline. Right, so in this position, we can defend the g7 pawn by playing knight to f5 or rook to g8, or first playing queen to a5, hitting this guy with tempo, and then play knight f5 or rook to g8. So I like Grandmaster Geary's recommendation of playing queen to a5 first. It is kind of funny that we're moving the queen again, but the thing is that the queen was kind of no longer really doing anything all that good on c7 anymore. And even though we kind of wasted a tempo with queen to c7, white, in turn, kind of wasted a tempo with bishop to d3. So overall, this line of play can be justified. So white will almost always defend the pawn on c3 with bishop to d2. I don't think any other moves make all that much sense. And now black could play rook to g8. But in my opinion, knight to f5 is just a lot more natural, a lot more intuitive. And before continuing, I thought that I should just introduce the players. So with the white pieces, we have Grandmaster Zoltán Almási. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he is a Grandmaster from Hungary. And in the past, he won the Hungarian Chess Championship 9 times. And not only that, but he has represented Hungary many times at the Olympiad. And for a brief period, his rating was above 2,700. I think it was about like 27, 26 at its absolute highest. So I would consider White to kind of be a super grandmaster. But with the black pieces, we have another very strong player. We have Grandmaster Alexander Beliavsky, who is a player from the Soviet Union, or I guess what would now be Ukraine. And I think he currently resides in Slovenia. And he was the USSR champion 4 times. And he also had a very good record, like beat many world champions at tournaments. Has many wins against world champions. Like I think he had some kind of record or something like that. So very cool stuff. And let's see. At the time of this game, I think White was about 2650 and Black was 2600. So very cool stuff. And this particular game, it was played at a tournament in Hungary in 1996, and unfortunately, I don't know any more information than that, but that kind of makes sense because this was kind of before the days of the internet when big tournaments would all have websites and that kind of stuff. But anyway, more information about the players and the event can be found in the video description. And now back to the game. So in this position, even though the engine does kind of give White an edge, it is very tricky to actually figure out how to actually have that evaluation materialize into anything. It's actually very tricky to find White's plan. And as, the queen, it kind of seems a bit oddly placed over here. Like, what is it really doing now? It's kind of out in the open. So anyway, the game, it continued with the move knight to f3. Black played knight to c6. Very reasonable stuff, very intuitive stuff. White now tried this queen to h5 idea, basically just trying to figure out what to do. And very often when White is playing queen to h5, part of the idea is to play knight to g5 with, some pressure on h7 and f7. And since the queen is on h5, it would actually be pinning the h6 pawn to the rook. So Black can't even really stop this with pawn to h6. But in this case, this isn't really that scary of an idea. Black just played pawn to h6 anyway. And if White now tried knight to g5, hitting this guy, Black could just play rook to f8. And even though this pawn is pinned, it is, pretty clutch that the bishop on c8 is defending the pawn on e6. Otherwise, knight takes e6 would be possible. But anyway, this is not what happened in the game. Instead, White kind of just keeps their queen here for a different reason, just constantly applying pressure to the f7 pawn so that Black's king is kind of discouraged from moving away. Anyway, White now castled kingside. Black played bishop to d7. And even though the players have been playing pretty reasonable moves, we've kind of noticed that White's advantage has kind of just vanished because White did not figure out, what it is that the engine would want White to do. But the thing about engines is that they play chess like aliens. It can be very difficult to actually figure out that stuff, especially over the board. Anyway, White now plays rook fb1, hitting the pawn on b7. And Black just castles queenside, defending the pawn this way. Now, Black does take their king's eye off of the pawn on f7, but taking this pawn is actually not such a good idea, although I guess White wanted to go get their, go steal a cookie from the cookie jar by taking it. The reason why it's generally not such a good idea to take these kinds of pawns is because you want to be very careful that, your own king does not get attacked, because when you have opposite side castling, very often you want to just get rid of these pawns so that your rooks can have open files that they can use to, put pressure and, go for some kind of mating attack, stuff like that. But anyway, after queen takes f7, black now played the move pawn to g5 with a very cool threat, a very cool idea. If you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out what the little threats, little idea behind pawn to g5 is. I will reveal the answer in 3, 2, 1. So basically, what black is threatening to do is play pawn to g4, forcing this knight to move away, and then one of black's knights can take the pawn on d4 over here. I don't think it matters which one, but basically the idea is that when this knight has moved away, like say to e1, then when white takes the knight back, the bishop on d2 would be hanging. The queen would just get in there and infiltrate and win back the material, and overall black will have won a pawn back. So in this position, the move that white needed to play was pawn to g4, and that is, very engine-like. That is not a like, the line that the engine gives is really quite something. It gives rook df8, queen to h5, knight to h4 since the knight was under attack, knight takes h4, now play knight takes d4 with, same similar stuff, similar idea. Yeah, like note that the bishop on e2 would be under attack at the end of this little combination, so both the knight and the bishop would be hit. Black would be able to, regain in the sacrifice knight on h4 as well. So after bishop to d1, g takes h4, queen takes h4, knight to f3 check, bishop takes f3, rook takes f3, queen e7, queen c7, and the engine still gives black a bit of an edge here, but this is not what happened in the game, and this is just some really crazy, sharp stuff. Instead, what happened in the game is white tried to solve the problem of pawn to g4 by just moving the bishop back to e1, where it's what's it called? Where it is defended by the rook. But black just plays pawn to g4 anyway, kind of discoordinating white's pieces and also kind of suppressing this bishop over here somewhat. Knight to d2. We have rook h g8, defending the pawn. White really does not like this pawn. This pawn's very annoying. It's taking away the f3 square from the knight. It's making the bishop very sad. And so we have pawn to h3. Black plays rook df8, and suddenly we realize that this queen is trapped. Like if it tries going to h5, rook to g5 will just take away its last, like we'll basically capture it, or complete the trap, I should say. And queen to h7 would be met with rook to g7. So here white decided to play queen takes f8 check. In my opinion, queen to h7, rook to g7, queen takes g7, knight takes g7 might have been better just to, have the knight come back. But white decided to do things this way. It probably doesn't matter too much. So we have rook takes f8, pawn takes g4, forcing the knight back, but the knight goes back to e7 instead of g7. We have knight to f1, defending the pawn on c3. Black is currently just kind of up an exchange of queen for rook. But white might be able to get some pawns or something, but generally some pawns are not much compensation for such an exchange. We have bishop to g6, bishop takes h6, rook h8, hitting the bishop. Bishop to d2, defending this pawn. bishop takes c2, rook to b2, bishop to g6, knight to g3, queen to c7, bishop to d1, and after black's next move, white now resigned. Like, black basically found a very cool idea that allowed them to somewhat simplify and kind of shatter white's pawn structure in a way. So if you want, you can pause the video and try to find it, try to understand it. I will reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. So basically, black played knight takes d4, and white can't really take back, because if white does, then black has moved pawn to c3, forking the bishop on d2 and the rook on b2. White can't play rook to c2 to pin the pawn to the queen because the bishop on g6 covers c2. And if white tries rook to c1 to pin the pawn to the queen that way, then black is very happy to just take on b2, and after rook takes c7, king takes c7, there will be absolutely nothing that could stop the pawn on b2 from promoting. So basically, black is just going to trade some pieces off and be doing very well, and white just doesn't really have any real compensation for the queen versus rook exchange, so white decided to resign here, which I think makes sense. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this game. This will be the last game on the French defense for a while. I hope that you enjoyed that series. I'm going to be covering some other openings very soon, so stay tuned for that. And as usual, if you liked what you saw, be sure to like, comment, subscribe. Bye for now.